I want to thank you all for coming. My name is Clark McCown. I'm the principal investigator of the project that we're going to be discussing, and I'm joined by my colleagues from Rush University Medical Center, Nicole Russo-Ponceron, who is the co-investigator on this project, Ashley Carls and Matthew Ronsky, who are research study coordinators and who've been instrumental in all aspects of the project, but in particular to the part of the project we're going to be discussing today. So today we're going to talk about, the title of the presentation is A Window into the Social Lives of Middle Schoolers. And we're really excited to share with you some of the things that we heard and learned from middle schoolers when we asked them as part of a research project that I'll be describing in a sec, to tell us a little bit about what it's like to be a middle schooler, what some of the challenges are, what some of the ways they cope with those challenges are. And it was really a wonderful experience because we learned that middle schoolers really, when adults ask them about their lives and they trust that the adults are listening, they'll tell you what's going on. I have a daughter myself who's 19 and in college, and she's a wonderful person. But I remember when she was in middle school and high school, and she'd come home from school and I'd say, "How was your day, Kate?" She'd say fine. So part of me was thinking in these focus groups, are we gonna get real insight into the lives of middle schoolers? Are they going to be willing to disclose? And in the most positive direction possible, they certainly surprised me in terms of their candor and articulateness about the experiences they're going through. Now, before I jump into the presentation, I mean, we don't have a ton of attendees, so I'm tempted to say that in the question and answer period at the end, you can come off mute and we can just have a conversation. But what we'd like to do, just in terms of housekeeping, is suggest that if, as we are talking, you have questions or thoughts that come up, if you could go ahead and type them into the chat window, that would be great. And my colleagues will be monitoring the chat/Q&A window. And when we get to the end of the presentation, we're going to set aside some time for conversation. And probably the first things that we'll be talking about are the questions and thoughts that you share with us as we go along. The other thing I'd want to acknowledge before beginning is the support of the Institute of Education Sciences, which is the U.S. Department of Education's research wing. IES funded this project, which is, as you'll see, focused on the development of a measure, an assessment tool to measure students, middle school students' social and emotional competence. So we're in the beginning-ish of the third year of a 4-year grant with them, and we're grateful for their support. I also want to acknowledge a conflict of interest that Dr. Russo-Ponceron and I have. While nothing that we're going to share here is commercially available, and we don't benefit from the sale of the middle school assessment or anything like that, CellWeb, the name CellWeb is shared with other assessments we've developed earlier that are commercially available. So it's possible that we could benefit financially from the results of the study that we're describing. Seems like an outside chance, and that is certainly not the purpose of our conversation today, but I just wanted to be transparent about our relationship to the commercially available versions of the assessment. Okay, so let's see if I still have control here. Yes, so let's talk about the background. Where did this project come from? How did we come to be talking with middle schoolers and talking with them about their lived experiences? Why did we want to do that, and where did that come from? Well, this is an assessment development project, as I mentioned, and the goal of the project is to create a web-based assessment of social emotional skills for middle schoolers. And the assessment is called CellWeb Middle School. And the purpose of the assessment is we envision it being used universally. So if a district were to adopt CellWeb Middle School, for example, they might administer it to all of their middle school students. And the purpose of administering the assessment, the purpose of the data, how we envision it being used, is by educators to better understand the social and emotional strengths and needs that students are bringing into the school. And typically, with some of our elementary versions of CellWeb, that first administration is in the fall, and that way educators can look at their data and make data-informed decisions about instruction, both the use of explicit SEL programs and other, say, academic integration strategies and other strategies to nurture student skill. It helps to focus effort in the area of widely shared need or areas of widely shared need among students. So that's what the overall goal of the project is, to develop this assessment. That's what we envision the assessment being used for. So how do we go about going from the idea of developing an assessment that's intended for these uses to an actual tool that educators can use to support practice? Well, the process, it's funny. I look at this as 4 steps, and this is absolutely right. It's almost like 4 check boxes. You could say, well, it's only 4 things, right? But the first part is creating the items for the assessment. So these are the questions basically we're going to ask students to try to assess the competencies they're bringing into school. We ask for, once we create those initial items, that's this team here and a couple of other team members who couldn't come today. Once we develop those items, we ask for input from experts and students. And you see how and students is italicized and boldface? That's because that's the part we're going to hone in on today, is what the students shared with us. And then after we get that input, we revise the items based on the input and do some field testing to evaluate the score reliability and validity of the assessment. So right now, we're really going to focus on the end students part of step 2. Just to give you a broad sense of what CellWeb Middle School is designed to assess, this is a wheel that was developed by the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, an SEL advocacy group in Chicago. And they have defined social emotional competencies as being made up of 5 important parts. And CellWeb Middle School is designed to assess those different parts. So self-awareness, we operationalize as understanding your own emotions, both the causes of emotions and what those emotions feel like when you experience them. So the reason I'm sharing this is because I want to give you a flavor for how do we actually think about what these skills are in the concrete terms that you could use to formulate questions to assess these skills. Self-management is also really important, and we operationalize that as the ability to manage emotions in 2 parts that are coping with unwanted emotions and being able to cope with the challenging situations that might provoke those emotions. Social awareness involves understanding others, and that includes understanding others' feelings and understanding others' perspectives. By the way, we won't talk about this very much, but of all 5 of the competencies that we've been working to develop ways to assess, this one has proved the most elusive in middle school. We've got wonderful ways to assess this in elementary school and late elementary school, but for some reason, we just haven't been able to find the right questions to get at this to yield a reliable score. We're working on it, though. The 4th competence that CellWeb Middle School is designed to assess is relationship skills. And we operationalize that as being able to manage challenging situations, including interpersonal conflict, disagreements, and the like, and peer pressure. And then finally is responsible decision making, which according to CASEL is made up of a number of different skills, but we decided to focus on sort of organization and time management, more of the executive functions portion of responsible decision making, in part because the other pieces of responsible decision making overlap a lot with interpersonal conflict resolution skills. So we thought we could be a little bit more targeted around responsible decision making. So what are the items? I promise we're going to get to the social lives of middle schoolers, but just to give you a flavor for the assessment, We asked we developed and asked three different kinds of questions to youth. One are factual questions, and those are really knowledge-based questions. Do kids really, for example, know what emotion regulation strategies are effective? So, for example, when somebody feels upset, which of the following actions can help them feel better? You know, there are certain emotion regulation strategies that we know are more effective than others. Sorry about the blue square. The second kind of question are situational judgment tasks, which are really have to do with the application of those skills to hypothetical situations. So we might ask a question like, imagine you and a classmate disagreed about how to do a group project. And then we might ask a series of questions about how they think about that situation and how they would try to work it out. So, you know, there's knowledge and then an attempt to get at how kids would apply that knowledge. And then the third kind of item that we developed are more standard self-report survey items where students rate their perceptions of their own skills. An example would be, I know how to calm down when something upsetting happens. And then they would rate how frequently that's true for them from, you know, very rarely true to very often true, for example. We, just to let you know, in some of our early field testing, we have found that the factual and situational judgment tasks, the scores on those items are highly correlated, which makes a lot of sense, but neither of them is very highly correlated with self-report. So this kind of suggests that that the sorts of questions that more directly are designed to more directly ascertain students' social emotional skills are a different thing than students' perceptions of their social and emotional skill to some degree, which kind of makes sense, but we have some evidence to support that these are different animals. So we focus on these two kinds of questions, the factual and situational judgment tasks, and we felt that we really needed student input to develop the right kinds of questions because after all, we're a bunch of adults ranging from, you know, young adults to pushing the boundaries of middle-aged adults, talking about me. And we're developing situational judgment tasks that we're imagining middle schoolers will use. And we think, well, we can get started on that, but we need to do a kind of validity check on the content of those items to make sure that they reflect the lived realities of middle school students. And that's where the focus groups came into play and where our conversation with you about the lived experiences of middle schoolers begins. So, Matthew, I'm going to hand it off to you to do the next couple of slides. Matthew Wronski was deeply involved in running the focus groups. He participated in all of them. He sat in on all of them. And so I'm going to ask Matthew if he wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about the participants and the methodology that we used. Matthew, why don't you take it from here?
Absolutely. And let's see if I can control it now. I can. Awesome. So thank you, Clark, for the introduction and background. And yes, I was heavily involved with these. The main facilitator of these groups, Nika Winiarski, I don't know if she's on the call, but she's a clinical psychologist at Rush who was fairly involved with us at the beginning. And so she helped facilitate the groups, and it was great to work with her on this work. So as for our participants, we had 19 students across 5 groups. And so each of these focus groups had anywhere between 2 and 6 participants in them. And typically that was within a single district. And I'll talk more about the districts in a little bit. But of course, they were all middle schoolers, average age 13 years old, kind of that emerging adolescence period, transition from childhood to adolescence. Mostly males, but we also had females in the groups. And exciting to report, as we intended to do, we had a wide range of backgrounds represented from our participants. So we had predominantly both white and Black or African American participants across the school districts, followed by some Asian and then some Hispanic, Latino representation. Although I'll say some of these groups might constitute both, since students could select multiple categories at a time. And then in terms of educational background, quite diverse. a variety of schools from different SES backgrounds in Illinois, so the Chicago area, as well as the Detroit area in Michigan. And what's exciting about this is that we can speak to not a single setting of middle school students talking to us, right? So it's not only predominantly white students from an affluent background telling us their perspectives. We get this universal, broad range of perspectives from different groups. So that was great to have. And as for how we ran these groups, us and a consultant of ours from UIC who's very well versed in running focus groups, she really was integral in helping develop our protocol. And the protocol was all virtual, so it was all on a Zoom meeting. Each group was about 75 minutes. Again, 2 to 6 students per group. We were really concerned about making sure they were engaged with us. So we made sure there was a lot of stuff up front to get them talking. We introduced ourselves with names, favorite color, and then we got them talking about what it's like to be a middle schooler. So the point of that was really to just engage them at all. Clark was saying near the beginning, the whole thing of middle school students maybe being apprehensive to talk, but when we create that environment up front to get them speaking, it turned out to be really successful. I mean, almost every group there is engagement, across the students. It wasn't even really one student dominating the whole time in many of the cases. So it was great to open it up that way. And then we jump into the bulk of the focus group, which is the lived experiences. So based on the SEL competencies that Clark was talking about, we actually framed some of our questions as open-ended questions for middle schoolers. So for example, what does a good friend look like? Something like that. Topics like friendship, problem solving, conflict resolution, peer pressure, all of that falls under relationship skills, whereas emotional regulation falls more under the self-management piece. So we wanted to really tap into those two competencies mainly. And then we also got feedback on our actual drafted items. Sometimes we straight up just asked, is this, like, does this kind of thing happen in middle school at all? And so what we did was presented students with samples of the actual drafted items and response options, and we would have them literally question by question, thumbs up, thumbs down, or thumbs in the middle, and then Nika would call on students to elaborate on their response. So that's how the groups worked. And now we're going to jump into what we actually found from running these groups. So Clark, I think I'll hand it off to you again. Yes. Are you muted? I can maybe unmute you. Let me try. I just requested to have you unmute. I have no idea why that happened.
Yeah, thank you. You can hear me now?
Yeah, yeah.
All of my buttons disappeared. I don't see the mute and unmute buttons anymore. So thank you for helping me get that done. Apologies to everybody for the technical difficulties. I will try to get us back to the slide that we were on. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about, and thank you, Matthew, for that really nice overview of the groups and what we did. I will say, and I don't think this is in the rest of the slides, so I wanted to share a quick anecdote about one of the key things we learned. So Matthew was mentioning that we shared some of the item content and got a sense of students' responses to it. And I'm not sure if I'm going to totally get this right, but we had one item that was a situational judgment task that had it was something along the lines of, imagine somebody said something mean about you on social media. That was the situational judgment task. And so we thought, oh yeah, we got this nailed. That must happen all the time. And we asked the focus groups, and they're like, we know what you mean by this, but that never happens. Like across the board, everybody's like, it just doesn't happen. So, it was really, and so we just dropped that. So it was really, really helpful to get a sense of where we were on the mark and where we were off the mark. But let's talk about not us, but the middle schoolers and what they had to say. So I'm sorry. Okay, so this is an example of one of the thumbs up, thumbs down items. So what we did is we said, which of the following is true about a good friend? And then we had a list of things that we had generated, and we asked them, we went through each one of them and said, thumbs up, is this true about a good friend? Thumbs down, is this not true about a good friend? Or thumbs in the middle, it kind of depends. And so there's all these statements. And wherever there's a lot of blue, that means that this was something that the sort of consensus characterizes good friendship. So I just want to share with you a few of the things they said is key to good friendship, and some things that weren't, and a surprise. So they won't share each other's private information. That's part of a good friendship. They enjoy spending time together. That's part of a good friendship. They trust each other. That's part of a good friendship. And they look out for each other. That's part of a good friendship. What is not part of a good friendship affirmatively? Well, they don't have to live in the same neighborhood. They don't have to go to the same school. That was sort of like, yeah, kind of, sort of, but that's not really the key to friendship. And they don't push each other to do things they don't want to do, which is kind of obvious, but we just wanted to see what folks had to say about that. And then there's this one up here that I find really intriguing. Because they're close, they get into lots of arguments. You see, it's exactly split between thumb up and thumbs down, but most everybody said thumbs in the middle. And in the context of some of the other comments that students made, this made us realize that, you know, we had, I think, a hypothesis that, yeah, this is not part of being a good friend. So it's going to be obvious, it's going to be a thumbs down. But that was different than how middle schoolers thought about it. They thought about it as, if you're close with somebody, inevitably you're going to get into conflicts. If you're a good friend, the conflicts don't really escalate to a high degree, and you have ways to work it out. But if there are other kinds of conflicts that are either escalate way too hot or that you can't work out, that really isn't characteristic of being a good friend. And so here's an example of where middle school students had a more nuanced conception of the characteristics of friendship, for example, than we thought they would. And I thought it was really, really interesting that they felt that way and recognized conflict as part of close relationships. So the kinds of questions we asked had to do with the students' lived experiences. We asked, what does it mean to be friends with someone? We asked about negative emotions, specifically anxiety, embarrassment, and worry. And we asked what causes these emotions and what can help when you feel them. We asked about social conflict. We asked what causes social conflict in your world, and what's helpful to resolve conflicts. And we asked about peer pressure. We asked what is peer pressure, what does it look like, and how can people respond to peer pressure in a positive way. Those are some of the key sorts of topics that we were focused on in the focus groups. Well, let's talk about friendship. So I shared with you the thumbs up, thumbs down, but I want to share with you some of the words that kids use to describe friendship. Some of the key aspects, as we mentioned, was fun and enjoyment, shared interests, reciprocity, not arguing too much. And kids said things like, we always have fun around each other. That was sort of a very common, not surprising description of good friendship. Or the second one, they offer to do what you want to do instead of like saying what they want to do. So, give and take and generosity as a part of friendship or something that middle schoolers are looking out for in a friend. The last one, I think you could get into arguments, but I don't think it's like constant arguing like over every single thing. Okay, so there's that example, the kind of inner thinking about that peculiar thumbs up, thumbs down response about conflict in friendship, where yeah, you can argue, but you're not going to argue over every little thing. And you get the sense that good friendships for middle schoolers, like for many people, isn't about not having conflict, but it's about sort of the ratio of enjoyment and trust to conflict. And if that ratio is favorable, of course, conflict is going to happen. Speaking of conflict, we asked students about the kinds of things that cause conflict in their lives. And this is aligned to relationship skills in the Castle model. And some of the most common things that came up, and this was, at least to me, a surprise, that were the causes of conflicts the middle schoolers were reporting were group projects. So a teacher assigns a group project, and students across, I mean, all of these examples, I just want to step back and echo something that Matthew said earlier, is that the settings from which we selected students to participate in the focus groups differ tremendously in terms of the resources of the communities and the backgrounds and experiences of the students. But it was, across these incredibly diverse settings, all students really noted that group projects are a hotbed of conflict for students. A second area of conflict is academics per se. So students can sometimes get into disagreements about answers to questions that teachers might ask. They can have strong opinions and argue about the issue with one another. And then the final one was we realized after looking at the data, it was almost exclusively boys in the focus groups who raised this. But apparently, and little did I know, 55-year-old me, that video games are a source of frequent conflict particularly between boys. So those are a few things that, and I'll tell you my thought about this is it's not all that surprising that these would be sources of conflict that students would raise. But what is surprising is I expected there to be more focus on kind of interpersonal challenges, conflicts, drama, rumors, things like that outside of the academic context. Now, maybe it was in part because we were asking about the middle school experience and they were thinking about being in school. But I do think that what's on middle schoolers' minds, a big part of what's on their minds is what goes down at school and how it goes down at school. Okay, so I think even though this might be a little bit of biased because of the context and the questions you were asking, I really think that one of the key lessons was they're thinking a lot about school, they're worrying a lot about school, they're trying to figure out how to do school to be successful academically and socially, and it's really, really important to middle schoolers across the spectrum. Okay, so what about solutions? So these are some of the conflicts that come up. What are some of the kinds of things that they raised as potential solutions? Well, some of the top suggestions and contributions to students were just let it go, don't be confrontational or rude, try to talk it through respectfully. For example, first student in that quote says, if you can see that they're not going to agree with you, then you should just like stop. That was a lot of people were just like, just stop, just don't escalate. The second student, I just had to like breathe and let it go. She was talking about a specific conflict that she experienced. So breathing, emotion regulation, again, stopping and letting it go. The last example, have a civil conversation. Don't be biased to your side. Be open to like other people's views. I thought that was very, very mature. Like if you're going to argue and have a conflict, try to see it from both sides, and that could be a path to resolution of the conflict. Okay, peer pressure. What about peer pressure? Also aligned to relationship skills and the Castle competencies. Well, how did students think about what peer pressure is? Well, they said stuff like, well, it's like somebody in your class pressuring you to do something. But the interesting thing was, and this was something that was illuminating for me, and I think my colleagues, that we had some situational judgment tasks where basically somebody who's not a close friend is pressuring you to do something, and then questions about like, what would you do? And it turned out that that kids in the focus group were like, well, you know what? If they're not really your friend, if you don't have a connection with them, whatever, it's not that big a deal. You can just like ignore them. But where peer pressure is felt most intensely and where the dilemma is most pronounced is when it's a friend or somebody you care about or look up to who's applying that peer pressure. So of course it's about when somebody in your class is pressuring you to do something, but really the key is it's when somebody who's important to you is pressuring you to do something. That is when peer pressure is really a profound dilemma for students. The other thing that was surprising, we went in a little, I'll just speak for myself, but a little naively thinking that peer pressure is pretty much a bad thing. It's almost always not a good thing for peers to be pressuring each other. And we asked about this, and students were like, actually peer pressure can be good. And across multiple groups, people said, you know what, if it's a friend who's pushing you to do something positive that you wouldn't otherwise do, they're pressuring you. They're pressuring you to do that, but it's not like they're pressuring you to do something negative. They're pressuring you to push yourself, to be better, to contribute something positive, to be successful. Then that could be a positive form of peer pressure. And so this student says it could be like they're pushing you to do something that's good, but you don't want to do it, like an assignment. So it's all about perspective. And I appreciate that. I think that's a nuanced and accurate view of the differences in different forms of peer pressure. What about negative emotions? Well, so this is aligned with self-awareness, knowing what you're feeling, and self-management, being able to cope with and manage particularly unwanted emotions. Well, what were some of the top sources of anxiety was mentioned? We asked about anxiety, but it was mentioned a lot. Top sources of anxiety reported in the focus groups. Academic stress was, I would say, pretty much the universal immediate thing that people talked about. That it's really, and some of this is maybe post-COVID, I don't know, but it's academic stress, big deal. Social status, making sure that you are connected maybe to the right people. Relationship problems, conflict between friends, also a source of anxiety. And just to amplify the salience of academic stress, the source of anxiety, this student says the deadlines of it usually stress out a lot of people. And there were a lot of comments similar to this, that schoolwork stresses students out. Top sources of anger included, maybe not surprisingly, given adolescents' orientation to justice, is injustice from teachers and social aggression, like bullying. When kids see bullying and mean behavior, it makes them really mad. So here are some examples. The teacher's picking on you for no reason. If the teacher just keeps on thinking you're doing something bad, you're going to get mad and frustrated because you feel like, why are they doing this to me? So, the flip side of this, I think one of the implications of this comment that came up is that middle school teachers, but the relationship they have with their students and the connections and ways that they treat their students has possibly more of an influence on the students than teachers are sometimes aware of. Do you know? Like, imagine the flip side of this. The teacher is being fair to you and pushing you to be your best. They keep calling on you and others because they really want to bring out the best in you, right? That's the flip side of this comment. Imagine how that would make this student feel, because it matters to this student and others how their teachers treat them. One of the common ways that people, deal with negative emotions is to cognitive reframing. So like focus on yourself. The student says, focus on yourself. And if they don't like you, then it's just too bad for them because you're probably a good person. So if they don't like you, just don't worry about it. So some self-talk, some cognitive reframing. Other strategies, people reported were doing enjoyable things, leaving the situation, and removing the source of anxiety if possible. So kids had a lot of ideas about strategies that actually we know to be effective to manage different emotions. Okay, so I'm going to hand the baton back over to Matthew to talk about some of the focus group takeaways and go from there. So I'm going to stop controlling the screen, Matthew, and it's all yours.
Yeah, that sounds good. And I think first, before we move on to the takeaways, just some other things. When I think about that first question we ask of what's it like to be a middle schooler right now. What's really something that jumped out to me in this whole exercise is that we got a lot of these comments about stress before we even probed for it. In our introductory questions, just to get people talking and opening up, already, already some distress was coming out from students, academic stress, worries related to middle school. And so I think that was quite striking. Also, to just consider the time frame of this, we ran these groups in spring of 2021. So um, very tough time for a lot of people with COVID. And so I think that was very clear in the groups. And another thing, kind of going back to our conversation about the conflicts, I recall, we didn't put this in the slides, but I recall a lot coming up about using evidence, use evidence to prove your point. Across groups, kids were talking about like using evidence to show you're the one that's right. And I thought that was really interesting and maybe speaks to middle schoolers starting to think more critically in the classroom, and maybe that sort of bleeds into their social interactions with people in terms of trying to say, I'm right because this, potentially because it goes hand in hand with learning to use evidence to support arguments in school and things like that. So I was reminded of that as Clark was talking about sources of conflict and strategies for dealing with conflicts. But yeah, in terms of overall takeaways from the group, context matters. We learned, yes. So a lot of our quite naive researcher focused questions of what do we think middle schoolers do, that was challenged by the middle schoolers themselves. And so situational interpretations and responses largely depend on the context. And middle schoolers really gave light to that in terms of their examples and what they had to say. And this actually really helped us in revising our items. And then we integrated feedback from the focus groups. Clark was talking about this at the top, along with other kinds of input, side by side, to really make sure we had their perspectives in our assessment for middle schoolers. And then beyond assessment development, this is really great because this work with the focus group data, it's really in some ways not at all over. We're working right now to revisit all of the transcripts, go back through and flag things we think are interesting. We have a revised set of codes that we looked at for the group. So really, this work is just starting, even though we've already used it to help the assessment. There's more to be done. There's more to be done with this data. So I thought I'd highlight that.
That sounds good, Matthew. And before we go on to the next part, I think I want to just ask my other colleagues from Rush if you have any other observations about the focus groups or the data or the stuff that we've discussed so far, because all of you have been involved in this, and I want to make sure we don't miss anything important.
Yeah. So I wasn't present for the focus groups, but I viewed them all and was involved in the coding. And something I noticed, particularly with the sources of conflict, was there, like Clark said, there was consensus around academics, group projects, like things that are classroom specific. But there were also these isolated, comments that do make sense, like when you think about it. So things like I think one or two, kids brought up rumors. So spreading rumors is something that they've experienced personally, and they're like, it just, the conflict explodes from that. Purposely trying to annoy others was another thing that somebody brought up. And then somebody, I thought this was kind of funny. Somebody brought up some people just don't know when to stop talking, and sometimes that can really annoy me. So just we got these isolated, more specific experiences that kids had that were socially based. And I would say one other thing that was a huge takeaway for me was just the nuance that the students brought to these groups. So, for example, the item feedback portion, of the group. So when we would present an item and the response options that we drafted, we gave them two options. So we asked for a thumbs up or a thumbs down, and the students were the ones that created the third option of the thumbs in the middle. And it really was like a, I can't really answer that question until I have more context. So we had, I think with the friendship one, for example, we had an answer option like, one of them makes most of the decisions, and from our perspective, that's like, well, that's a really negative thing. That's really bossy. And the kids kind of started this conversation like, well, different people can have different personalities, and if there is a dynamic where there, both sides have different roles, that's okay, as long as everybody feels respected and heard. So things like that, where they were like, most of these things, it depends on the context and the people that are involved. So I thought that was fascinating to kind of see them initiate that, and it really was like instrumental in revising items, and then adding in that context and making sure that we didn't miss that nuance in what we were doing. So it was, to me, it was fascinating.
Thanks, Ashley, and Matthew, for adding those observations. It's such a good reminder that even though what we're highlighting today is comments that came up frequently, the sorts of themes that we felt like they're prominent and they're common across groups, and both focus groups and socio-demographic groups, that there were other comments that are insightful and revealing, that maybe came up less frequently, and we shouldn't lose sight of those as well. Let's shift gears for a second, talk about opportunities for you to be involved in this work moving forward, should you want to. Nicole, I'm going to ask you to take the mic from here and go ahead and talk a little bit about the next steps in the CellWeb Middle School development process.
Sure. So as we mentioned at the onset, this was all in service to developing an assessment tool that can measure the social emotional experiences and competencies of middle schoolers. And so we are engaged in a very rigorous process to refine our items and have an assessment that is web-based, that the schools can use to measure as a benchmarking their students' social emotional competencies. And so we are using data collected from the focus groups, data collected from early classroom-based assessments, and some early validation data that we're collecting on individual students. So we have an ongoing effort right now to collect the CellWeb Middle School data with the existing items that we have and some new items that we're trying out. And we are comparing that to other social emotional measures that we have that are available to us. And so we are looking for middle school students to complete an 1.5-hour assessment study virtually, so they can do a remote research opportunity, and they would complete CellWeb and some additional measures, and we would ask for a teacher report questionnaire as well. And we'll use those data to really show that the items that we've created are measuring, in fact, the skills and experiences that we want to be measuring and believe we are measuring. We are also looking for classrooms to participate in our research efforts. So if you have if you're a teacher and you want to use CellWeb Middle School and you think this data would be useful to you in understanding your students, then we encourage you to reach out to our research coordinators. I believe on the next slide we have kind of the QR code and other study information, but please engage with us and let us know if you'd like to talk about using CellWeb with your students, and if you have the ability for us to recruit students individually from your schools as well. Once we believe that our assessment is functioning the way that it's intended to, then we'll be collecting data classroom-wide across the nation, recruiting schools and sites to do data collection on CellWeb Middle School with us. I will also just kind of add a little caveat here. I think one of the pieces that I don't believe we have with our focus group data, we didn't really dig into the socioeconomic piece. So while the academic and social experience of this group was from a pretty broad demographic group, it may be that there are other experiences that we didn't quite capture. And so I think when we look at doing this on a national scale, getting data from as many students with as many different backgrounds is really what's going to help make this tool meaningful in a broad context. And so really encourage you, if you have any friends or family or know of any schools in any area across the United States that might be interested in having this data collected, it will really help us understand how universal these competencies and experiences are, and will help us develop norms that are really meaningful. So that's my little tag on this. So please encourage your families and students to get involved.
Thanks a lot, Nicole. And the validation study, as Nicole was mentioning, if you want to reach out, we have you can scan the QR code or reach out via this email address or telephone number, and we will let you know more about it. Basically, we're comparing Selwyn Middle School performance to other measures of social emotional competence, which gives us a sense of the validity of the assessment. Schools and individuals are welcome to try. So let's go into questions. We have our QR code for those who are interested in more. And oops, sorry about that. Did any questions come through the chat, Ashley, Matthew, or Nicole, that we can tackle? Or are there any questions that the participants have right now that you would like to discuss?
One of the questions that came up, was about the groups themselves and how heterogeneous those groups were. So Matthew, I know you were sitting in on all of the groups. Maybe you can talk a bit about that.
Yeah, so heterogeneous in terms of
Well, I think that, I would just assume that we're talking about sort of socio-demographic heterogeneity. And I'll start, and then Matthew, you can fill in color commentary, which
Sure.
is, the focus groups, if I remember correctly, were students who all went to the same school. And so while there may have been there's always heterogeneity within a school. They were mixed boys and girls, but the kids themselves came from, in general, the same community. So there were, in that sense, there was some homogeneity to it, and at least, or maybe better put, familiarity with each other. These are students who might have known one another and certainly traveled in similar circles and had similar experiences. Matthew, did you want to add anything to that or correct that?
No, that's actually spot on. Yeah, great.
Okay. Other questions?
I guess I would encourage anyone to unmute or send a message in the chat if you'd like to be unmuted.
Looks like Susan raised her hand.
There.
I'm not sure how to unmute Susan. Do you know, Matthew?
I probably can. I just requested that you unmute.
Susan, you should be unmuted now. Tell us.
Yeah.
Right. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. I've taught for a really long time. I'm currently at a school which is K-8. So the middle school is with the elementary school. I was there for a couple years. In general, watching those middle schoolers, I'm the mother of middle schoolers. I'm a former middle schooler. Kids are happy. Middle schoolers just seem happier in that environment than they were isolated in a middle school. I was just wondering, has that factored into your data at all, or what were all of your schools just middle schools?
Matthew, you may know because I think you're more familiar with the settings you recruited from. I think most of them were just middle schools. But before, Matthew, you answer that question, I will say your observation, Susan, is totally supported by the research. And it's been a while, but I think in the 1990s, which seems like forever ago, Jackie Eccles and her team at the University of Michigan wrote a lot of really compelling work and supplied a lot of compelling data to suggest that what you're saying is not just a feeling, but is a fact that when in K-8 schools, the sixth graders, seventh graders, eighth graders tend to feel more connected to school. happier and are more successful. And her theory was that, when you go from a sort of like single classroom that's really warm and relationship focused in elementary school to a departmentalized middle school, where you're going from class to class and you don't necessarily have history or connections with the teachers. What's happening is that just when middle schoolers most need that connection with an adult because they're trying to figure stuff out, stuff is structured so that they aren't as likely to have that kind of positive connection, leading to a real decrease in engagement and satisfaction and happiness. I don't know whether that's the reason, but I think, your observation is certainly supported by.
And there's just so many opportunities for them to be leaders, and they
Yes.
can go help the younger ones. And I don't know, I think the whole world needs recess, so they still get things like recess. They're, I think everybody needs I need recess,
I know.
I just think I've just watched, and I live in Wisconsin, I live in Green Bay, and it's trending back that way.
Mm-hmm.
And kids are going to those schools, but I don't have any hard evidence, but just in general, it's a better vibe. Because my own children who are very academically successful,
Mm-hmm.
they loathe middle school for the most part. It was just the whole, it's kind of like college when you're just with all the same people.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just wondering if that would ever factor into any of your research.
I probably should. I think it would be really, really interesting. There are two things I think of, like if we had the resources to do it, to ask these very same questions more intentionally to middle schoolers who are in a K-8 school versus middle schoolers who are in.
They just seem happier.
Yeah,
And I've been
exactly.
in both situations, and I live in an area where you can take there's school choice.
Yeah.
You can use your voucher. So the parochial schools tend to be K-8,
Yes.
but
Yep.
many of the children there are not of a religious. They're not going there for religious things. They're going there for that one of the K-8. All the people in the family at the same school. So it's just interesting.
Well, it'll be interesting to see if students perform differently on our assessment if they're in K-8 schools or in separate middle schools. I know that the core districts in California, this is a big consortium of school districts serving millions of kids. Several years back, they started administering social emotional surveys, really brief surveys, so not quite the depth of our assessments, but if you look at some of the published work from the core districts, what you find is that on measures of like self-efficacy and growth mindset and the things they were measuring, things kind of like get better and better. And then at middle school, they go down.
Right.
And it's not clear to me whether that's because middle schoolers start to interpret the meaning of those questions differently or kind of are looking at their reference group differently, or whether those things actually are going down. But judging from your observations, I guess my hypothesis would be this probably is a true decline. And I wonder if you looked at those trends in K-8 schools versus separate middle schools, whether you'd find a difference.
And also, like, I had girls, so they always said, be careful, girls dumb down in middle school because they start wanting boys' approval, blah, blah, blah. And then they even tried having classes where we're just going to have an all-girl math class or all boy, so they weren't intimidated by that. So it's just curious. I love your research. And then did you say the children weren't as worried about being bullied on social media? Because that seems to be so out there in the media.
Matthew.
I was shocked at how little social media was elaborated on. So that was an area we asked about. I'm trying to remember what our Clark mentioned our situational judgment task, which was more, I feel like, more related to that social element of getting everyone in on liking a mean post, kind of this form of like social media based bullying, and that kind of situation just didn't resonate with them. We wonder whether it's more of a high school thing than a middle school thing. I mean, we have very little data to go off of just
Yeah.
working with middle schoolers, but I recall debriefs where we were like, maybe middle schoolers aren't yet engaging in social media in the same sort of complex way that high schoolers are.
And I would
Also-
say,
Data to back that up. But
and I would say they are a little bit, but they also see the fakiness of it.
Yeah.
And and we give them courses on, though you do not have 300 friends. That is not a friend. That would be a question. Is someone your friend on social media? Meet
Right.
your definition of a friend.
Yeah.
And nobody wants to be a follower. I'm not a follower of anybody.
Yeah.
So some of those terms, but there's a lot of courses that we coach kids in.
Mhm.
And to understand that, but they're like, oh yeah, that's all fake,
Yeah,
so
That's
I think
really
it-
interesting.
It is interesting, and I will say that we have to remember that 19 students participated in our focus groups, and so that's not a huge group. So I don't want to discount the fact that cyberbullying does happen.
well, right.
It's highly consequential. I think the conclusion I'd make from our small sample is it may not be like as prominent in the daily lives of your typical middle schooler as we anticipated that it would be. I think it's probably a low frequency, high impact event in the middle school world. That would be my hypothesis from the data we have. And Susan,
That's
if maybe
awesome.
the kinds of things that you're teaching kids, those I do think that kids are getting more savvy about social media and really understand the difference between communications via social media and real interpersonal communications. I see that MC Nelson has a hand up. Wonder if you can unmute and ask your question.
That so many thoughts. This was really fantastic. I think it's so exciting. I think it's information we really need, and just the value and importance of relevancy when we're developing these things.
Yeah.
I'm sort of adjacent to Clark right now. I'm one of the lead SMEs on the Harmony SEL.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. So this is as we, if ever, wrap this project up. But these types of questions are so in the forefront, because even as we're developing programming materials, like, of course, we're like social media, and like the programming itself that then we're going to be assessing on, if it's not relevant, it's not meaningful.
Right.
I wanted to loop back to what I was asking about, whether the groups were, heterogeneous or homogeneous in terms of geographic context, but socio-demographics, because very much like the speaker just brought up, is, when we have cross age, when we have, cultural diversity, there's an organic, lived experience knowledge of social emotional learning. And so I'm wondering if the responses we get in those settings, which I understand are hard to find, are different than what we find in homogeneous settings where there isn't that same lived experience. And what was I had another question related to that, but sorry, my other related question is, it's a separate one, but what level of social emotional learning had these groups already been exposed to, whether it's formal or informal, right? Because you're going to have instructors who, it sounds like the last question asker was, someone who is organically doing SEL, programming. But what was that a component of your research of what prior exposure they had, again, whether formal or informal?
Yeah, so these are great questions. And to the latter question, I only vaguely know what SEL instruction students were exposed to. I know that in at least two of the settings, there were some intentional SEL initiatives going on, but what they were using in terms of curricula and other strategies is still a little bit vague to me. I don't believe that I would characterize either of these settings as being like high implementation SEL. That's my sort of shoot from the hip, but it's not very systematic. To the first question about sort of it's a really interesting question, really important. You know, how might it be different if we had included focus groups of schools that maybe had a greater representation of diverse groups socioeconomically, ethnically, and so on, because these were homogeneous-ish within schools, but heterogeneous across the different schools and focus groups. And I don't know the answer to that. I will say that I don't think any of us on the Rush team would pretend that 4 focus groups, including 19 students, reflects the entire range of views of middle school students. And I imagine
Right.
that there's a lot that's, being that could be gleaned from being more intentional about recruitment in different kinds of settings. And I think you should do that as you work on the Harmony SEL program and
Mhm.
let us know what you learn.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Was there another question that just came in the chat? And then we're a little bit over time, but I want to make sure that give folks a chance who have questions. My chat box has disappeared, so I can't see it anymore. I don't know what.
No, there was just a thank you that and a well wish for our research.
Well, I know there are a handful of folks left. I want to be respectful of your time. We've already run over a few minutes, but thank you for coming. Appreciate your attendance and your interest in the topic. And again, if anything's come up or we can be helpful in any way, please feel free to reach out.
Thank you.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Thanks.